Right, good evening, tenants and landlords. My name's Danny. It's my own worst enemy, mental health podcast. Right, I'm not going to rabbit on too long this week. The intro was something like 20 minutes long last week. It's getting ridiculous, turning into the Danny Whittaker show. But, however, a couple of fun little things happened over the past week I think are worth mentioning. Firstly, turned 35 on Thursday. That was rough. Marks 5 years since I had my first little loopy mental breakdown back in 2012, because it happened right before my 30th birthday, the first time, a couple of weeks before. So, yeah, that was sort of a lovely anniversary. 1 year closer to death, and half a decade as a Fruit Loop. Me man was on at me about buying me a laptop for my birthday to sort of help me speed up the whole podcast production thing, because, yeah, this old jalopy I've got at the minute is pretty much as old as me, and it's basically a potato with a mouse plugged into the side of it. But I made her buy me an exercise bike instead, because I went to try and do some clothes shopping a couple of weeks back, and saw myself in the changing room mirror, shirtless, under 100-watt lighting, and let me tell you, it's not good for the six-pack, this agoraphobia lark. I look like Jabba the fucking up with my shirt off. So, yeah, that needs to change before I hit 40, or I'll be due another nervous breakdown then as well. Speaking of getting old as well, right? In bed with Leanne the other day, right? Having a kiss and a cuddle, about to do what grown-ups do. And, yeah, right in the middle of it, she suddenly pipes up with, "What do you want to happen to the kids if we die?" Like, what? Starts going on about us needing to make a will and all this lot because we're getting older now, and who's going to have the kids if we snuff it, and worried about them ending up in care or something. So, yeah, someone needs to work on a pillow talk. I think it's because she's just turned 29. She turned 29 in August, so I reckon next year she's going to have the same sort of midlife crisis as me when she turns 30. So, yeah, there'll be two of us then. She can join me as co-host on this tin pot little podcast. Hey, saying that, forgot about this. 50,000 plays we've had so far between SoundCloud and YouTube. So, yeah, maybe not such a tin pot little podcast anymore after all. Doing all right, aren't we? Anyway, there we go. What's that? 3 minutes. That'll do. Let's crack on. Right, today's topic: how the mental health industry fails the mentally ill. My guest today is DJ Jaffe. DJ is a writer and activist whose work is focused on improving care for the 4% of people who are the most severely mentally ill, including those with schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. DJ is the founder and executive director of Mental Illness Policy Org, a think tank dedicated to providing law enforcement, the media, and policymakers with unbiased information on issues affecting the seriously mentally ill. His op-eds have appeared in the New York Times, Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal, and he is the author of the book which forms the basis of today's discussion, Insane Consequences: How the Mental Health Industry Fails the Mentally Ill. Now, I can't quite remember how I stumbled across DJ, but I kept seeing people talking about his book on Twitter. I guess it must have been around about the time it came out earlier this year, like March, April, something like that. And even though it's sort of written specifically about US policy, I thought I'd give it a crack, just because people were talking about it and it was getting really good reviews. Anyway, let me tell you, if you're a mental health advocate like me and you think you've got your ducks in a row, a little experiment in how open you are to having some of your beliefs and ideas challenged. I dare you to give this book a read, because, yeah, this book made me realise, as much as I may be doing with this little project to kind of, help and inform people about mental health, I don't do fuck all to help the most seriously mentally ill. Those people who are living on the streets, eating out of dumpsters, people that are incarcerated, people going with inadequate treatment, like families who are struggling to cope with a seriously mentally ill family member. my little podcast, me rabbiting on about my experiences with anxiety and agoraphobia, isn't doing anything to help those people, at least not by any meaningful metric, which is just one of the distinctions I've learned from DJ. And also, I think in all honesty, the mental health industry as a whole, particularly mental health, is this kind of fashionable media movement that's part of the cultural zeitgeist at the moment. That doesn't even include those people in the conversation. It's almost as if, like, the worst case scenarios, the homeless, the people in prison, people convicted of violent offences as a direct result of their mental health conditions, it's sort of like those people are kind of kicked out of the mental health club. Like, they don't belong over here with us. I think at best it's not pretty enough, it's not marketable enough, like it's bad for the brand. But at worst, it's like, you know, whatever happened to those people has got nothing to do with mental illness. They're just criminals, or they're evil, or they're, you know, just outcasts or whatever. And this book makes a really strong case for that. Not only is the mental health industry, people like me, not doing enough to help these people, but in some cases, we're actually making things worse. So, yeah, if you're one of these people, you're a mental health advocate, campaigner, blogger, podcaster, whatever, when you listen to this interview, don't just immediately go on the defensive and jump on the mock outrage train. Listen to what DJ has to say, let it swirl around a little bit, and then be honest with yourself as to whether this movement that you're a part of is actually doing right by the people who are most seriously mentally ill. And if the conclusion you come to is no, it's not, then the next question to ask yourself is, what are you going to do to help tip the balance a little more? So for me, there's a mental health charity that I've had some involvement with in the past couple of years, sort of directing proceeds their way from some events I've been involved in. I won't name them, but yeah, since reading this book, especially since speaking to DJ, I've decided that from now on, my support is going to be redirected elsewhere to a charity that deals with more immediate and more serious issues related to mental health. So yeah, like I say, it troubled me, this topic, and I hope it troubles you as well, because it should. So anyway, you can follow DJ on Twitter. He's at Mental Ill Policy, at Mental Ill Policy. As always, if you'd like to comment on this episode, you can do so by going to myownworstenemy.org. That's also where you'll find all the show notes and any other relevant links and information. If you're enjoying this podcast and you'd like to support it, you can make a donation from as little as £1. Just go to myownworstenemy.org/support. On that note, I'm going to be offering some bonus episodes and a few little extras exclusively for supporters pretty soon as well. So yeah, something else to look forward to. Little warning with this episode, we did have some audio glitches on the day. You'll probably notice the point at which we switch from Skype to a landline. The sound quality goes down a little bit, but, you know, as always, done my best to kind of clean up the audio as much as possible. So, yeah, with all that said, please enjoy my conversation with DJ Jaffe. Okay, DJ Jaffe, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for taking the time to join me. I think a topic that might rile a few people up today, which is good. It's definitely a subject that needs debating, and we're talking about how the mental health industry fails the mentally ill, specifically the most seriously mentally ill. However, as always, before we jump into the thick of it and start getting ourselves in trouble, if you could just tell us a little bit about you, what your story is, how you came to be an advocate for the seriously mentally ill.
About 30 years ago, my wife and I became guardians for her sister who had schizophrenia, and she came to live with us in New York City, and she had several hospitalizations, and we weren't allowed to be told what was wrong with her, what medication she's on, when her next appointments were. So we couldn't facilitate treatment for her. And as a result, she had several relapses. And during that period, I discovered how horrific the mental health system is. I started volunteering for a local group, a local chapter of the National Alliance on Mental Illness, and I started writing fact sheets for them. And I wrote fact sheets for what people were calling about, and they were what you'd expect. The calls were, how do I plan my estate? How do I find the right medicine? How do I find the right doctor? How do I find housing for someone with serious mental illness? And I could write fact sheets for those. But one call was, my mentally ill son, brother, sister, mother, father, daughter is locked in their room, thinks the FBI planted a transmitter in their head, won't come out because they think we're poisoning the food. What can I do? And the reality was I could write no fact sheet for that. The families had already tried empathizing, cajoling, convincing, using logic, bribing to get their ill relative to see that they needed treatment, but nothing worked. And what the families were faced with was that the law prevented them from doing anything until after they became danger to self or others. As ludicrous as it sounds, the law required dangerous behavior rather than prevented it. And anyone well enough to walk into a hospital and say, I'm mentally ill, I need help, was presumed to be not sick enough to need hospitalization. So voluntary treatment was largely off the table. And if they were so sick that they didn't recognize they need treatment, they couldn't be treated till after they became danger to self or others. So involuntary treatment was largely off the table. Nobody was focusing on these particular issues. How do we prevent the most seriously mentally ill from deteriorating to the point where they become homeless, psychotic, arrested, incarcerated, and violent? And that's what I've been focusing on.
What was you, out of interest, what was you doing before you entered this field, just career-wise? Have you worked in psychology or anything like that?
Nope. This is not a career. It's a love. I was in advertising, and in fact, I was a creative director during most of that period at large ad agencies, and this was all pro bono work. And as part of, I now have an organization called Mental Illness Policy Org, and that's also pro bono. So I don't take any money for doing this, and I take some money if people want to donate, but none from healthcare, government, pharmaceutical companies, so I can talk truth to power.
Yeah, well, I think as well, I read your book, Insane Consequences, and then I've been online and seen what some of your critics have had to say about it. And yeah, one of the things that obviously that stands out to me anyway was that because of this familial relationship, you've got skin in the game, whereas a lot of your critics haven't. And the same for a lot of people that you mention in your book, the friends and relatives of people with severe mental illness, whereas a lot of people arguing against some of the points you raise are just academics, which I think is worth mentioning. Also, before we get into it, lest anyone accuse you of being some sort of right-wing fascist or overly conservative or anything like that, because there's a lot of politics involved in what we're going to be talking about. I think you've mentioned that you identify as a left-wing Democrat in a couple of your articles as well.
Yeah. No, I am. I've worked on the Obama campaign. I've been a liberal all my life, and I think helping people who need help the most is a very liberal, smart, compassionate thing to do. And I'm just surprised that my fellow liberals don't see it that way. But it used to be, unfortunately, my fellow Democrats they're very willing to throw money at mental health, improving people's wellness, but they're not willing to admit some of the unpleasant truths that need to be admitted to help the most seriously ill. Not everyone recovers. That's something we have to admit. Some people do need hospitals. That's something we have to admit. Closing hospitals increased incarceration. That's something we have to admit. There's many more of these unpleasant truths which in the liberals in the mental health system don't want to admit. And let me say that I honestly believe that the only opposition to the things that I advocate for is coming from a tempest in a teapot of those who work within the mental health system. Even Democrats and the public, police, patients agree with what I'm saying. Unfortunately, at least in America, the same way the finance industry has a hold over government financial regulation, in the U.S., the mental health industry has a stranglehold over mental health laws and policies. So it's only that tempest in a teapot that disagrees with me.
Yeah, so I think to get us started and sort of fire us out of the cannon, I think there's a couple of quotes from your book I'd like to read out, because I think they're a nice little summary of the issues that we're going to be covering.
Would it be helpful if I first explain what the premise of the book is before going into some of the details?
Yeah, feel free. Do that. That's fine. Yeah.
Okay, so the premise of the book is basically that we're spending too much money on mental health, improving wellness, and we're not spending enough money on the most seriously ill. So while the standard argument is that we're not spending enough money, what my book shows is that we're spending a lot of money, but we're not spending it to help the seriously mentally ill. By way of background, 100% of the population can have their mental health improved. 18% have something that's in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. By the way, half of that's relatively minor: ADHD, minor depression, restless leg syndrome, things like that. But there are 4% who have a serious and persistent mental illness. And by that I mean it's one that significantly affects their ability to function on their own. And you can argue whether it's 4%, 10%, where the border between normal and sick is, but the extremities are fairly clear. When someone thinks the FBI planted a transmitter in their head, most people would say, well, that's somebody who's seriously mentally ill. So the book says that basically, if we focus on those who are seriously ill, rather than continuing to expand the number of people we define as ill, we can start making progress. And that's the basic premise of the book.
Well, DJ, taking the quotes right out of my mouth there for summarising where we're standing, which is perfect. And also, you're giving us the perfect segue into my opening question, which is like an expansion on what you've just mentioned for this idea of a serious mental illness, which is immediately a divisive argument. So I'd like to just dig down into that a little more first and go into some of the specifics for how we define precisely what a serious mental illness is, as opposed to a non-serious mental illness, whether there's an official definition and what precisely is your definition, and then we'll kind of unpack that from there.
Okay. The definition that I've been using in the book is one created by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration in response to a request by Congress. And what they basically said was that a serious mental illness is one that creates a major functional impairment in someone that's likely to last, I believe, longer than a year. There have been many other official definitions, too. When they passed the Parity Act to provide parity for mental health coverage, they also had to define serious mental illness, and then various states have done it. I use the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration one because there's an awful lot of data on it. But basically, a serious mental illness is one that has a major impact that prevents you from providing for your own health, your own welfare, making decisions, providing for food, shelter, clothing, and doing these major daily living skills. Now, the bulk of the disorders that would comprise it are schizophrenia and severe bipolar disorder. But many other illnesses can be serious or not. For instance, some people with obsessive compulsive disorder do quite well, and other ones can't leave the house for fear that they didn't shut off the lights. So it's not a definition based on diagnosis, although, as I said, most of those with it would have schizophrenia or severe bipolar disorder, treatment-resistant Whether it's 4% of the population that has that or 5% or, where the dividing line is not as largely relevant as the fact that the extremities are clear. And there are people at the extreme end of mental illness who need help the most. And as a kind and compassionate society, that's who we should be offering help to first.
Yeah, I'd guess that one of the arguments you'd probably get thrown at you quite commonly would be people saying, well, I haven't got like schizophrenia, bipolar or anything, but my anxiety, I've had anxiety and it's been completely debilitating, and because of it I've had to quit my job and I get very serious panic attacks, and I've had to admit myself to the emergency room a few times. So why is that not a serious mental illness? That feels like a serious mental illness to me.
As I said, if it's impacting to the point where they can't work, where they need hospitalization, then in fact that would be a serious mental illness.
Yeah. Also, well, one of the interesting things that you point out as well, which I think is a good distinction between the two, is in the book, is that saying that there's a lot of scientific evidence that serious mental illnesses like bipolar and schizophrenia are actual physical brain disorders that can be seen on MRI scans.
There's what's happened is, and there was a great book by Dr. Alan Francis, who was the former head of the American Psychiatric Association, and it was called Saving Normal. And basically what we've done is we've expanded the definition of what constitutes a mental illness now. Basically, for instance, bullying and cyberbullying used to be bad behavior. Now that's a mental illness. Trauma has never been a mental illness. Everyone loses a family member, loses a home, loses a job, suffers a setback. Now PTSD is a mental illness, and that can run from minor to severe. But now trauma in and of itself is considered a mental illness. We're wrapping a whole bunch of social services in a mental health narrative and claiming that they're mental illnesses. A kid gets bad grades, we send a mental health worker after them. A kid becomes sad or withdrawn, we send a mental health worker after them. So we're continually expanding the definition of what constitutes a mental illness, and we're driving funds to that. Trauma is probably one of the most prevalent ones, and trauma is anything anyone thinks is traumatizing. Now, being traumatized is not a mental illness, but that's where we're sending money to.
Yeah, I've got to say as well, I mean, when I was reading some, like the various rebuttals to some of your arguments, I've got to say, well, from someone, you see, I've struggled with an anxiety disorder. But it's pretty severe at one point. I went through a short period of like suicidal ideation, and it did things like, it affected my ability to work. But regardless of that, I can still appreciate the distinction between the two that you're making. And I'm just wondering whether this, like people's insistence on kind of arguing this point against you, is whether it just comes from this kind of outrage culture that we've got at the moment, and everyone's looking for something to be offended about because, I mean, what do you think about that?
Some families of the seriously ill who can't get care for their loved ones have recently told me that their new plan is to act offended that they can't get care for their loved ones, and then they'll be able to get care because people will want to address the fact that they're offended rather than the fact that their kid has serious mental illness. But listen, I wish there was money to spend on everyone for everything. As a kind and compassionate society, I think we have to help those who need help the most first, and we have to make those decisions. And what's happened is that increasing mental health budgets, any increase in spending tends to go to the highest functioning, while the cutbacks go to the seriously ill. So, for instance, the increases in funding have gone to bullying, cyberbullying, trauma, helping kids get better grades, helping people deal with sexual identity questions that they may have, but the cutbacks go to hospitals and programs that serve the psychotic. So that's the reality we have to deal with. And the mental health industry is largely responsible for it because, as I said, my belief is that the public is wholeheartedly behind what I'm saying, but it is the mental health industry that has a stranglehold on spending.
I suppose one argument that could be put forward is that by spending the bulk of funding on mild, say moderate mental illness, that it's possibly helping prevent those people from becoming full-blown psychotic illnesses and developing into things like bipolar schizophrenia. What would you say to that?
Yeah. No one knows the cause of schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, so we don't know how to prevent it. A Nobel Prize will go to whoever discovers how to prevent schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. And this is one of the ways the industry diverts funds. They go to legislators and say, oh, if we invest early, then we can prevent mental illness, and there's simply no scientific basis that you can prevent schizophrenia or bipolar, which make up the bulk of those. I don't think there's even any on OCD and some of the others that you can actually prevent it. Now, there are early intervention programs, but the first episode psychosis programs treat people who already have psychosis. So these are not prevention programs. They are treating people who already have it and preventing it from becoming severe and disabling, but they are not preventing the disorder. And the average age of people, I forget if it's average or median, of people in those programs is 23 years old. But the industry goes and says, oh, if we start a program in elementary school or high school, or, education programs are huge ones, let's educate people and we're going to somehow prevent mental illness. And there's just no evidence that for serious mental illness that any of this is true.
Yeah, another important distinction to make between the two as well, and this is kind of going to take up the bulk of our conversation, is, this idea of a mental illness kind of affecting your ability to live is obviously a consequence that all of us can face. However, no matter how bad my anxiety is, the chances of me being incarcerated or ending up homeless or being physically assaulted as a direct consequence of anxiety are pretty much non-existent, I think, at least comparatively. And again, to quote from your book here, people with untreated serious mental illness are more often victimised than the general public. In their psychotic and delusional state, they are often robbed and raped in shelters, randomly beaten in the street, stuck up by drug dealers, and forced to live a hellish existence. I think that, for me, that marks a pretty good dividing line between what constitutes, if anyone's not convinced, that's a pretty good dividing line between what constitutes a serious and a non-serious mental illness. And
even that fact, the industry, the mental health industry, distorts. So what they do is they constantly go around saying, well, we have to do more, we have to invest more in mental health and mental wellness, whatever that is, because people with mental illness die X number of years earlier. But the reason they die X number of years earlier has to do with things like smoking, being homeless, being psychotic, being incarcerated, the very things that result from not giving them treatment.
Yeah. So let me read a paragraph from the book again, and this kind of gives us the state of play, like the situation we're in at the moment. So, there are 43 million Americans over 18 affected with any mental illness, and 10 million with serious mental illness. At least 140,000 of these, seriously mentally ill, are homeless, and often can be seen foraging in dumpsters, engaged in pitched battles with demons only they can see. Some 392,000 are in jails and prisons. An additional 755,000 are on probation or parole, and many of them will return to jail or prison multiple times. At least 95,000 who need hospitalisation can't get a bed because of the deadly shortage, and more than 5,000 kill themselves every year. So, I think two questions arise immediately from that, and that is, one, why are so many people in prison on probation and parole? And why is there a lack of hospital beds? And these are the things I'd like to dig into now. So I think, leaving solutions aside for the moment, because we'll get to those, and just kind of focusing on the reasons the problems exist. Firstly, Go ahead.
The reasons there aren't enough hospitals is because the mental health industry wants to close them. Many in the mental health industry have this mistaken belief. First of all, they have a process they call reinvestment. They believe, if we can close those expensive hospitals, then the money will flow to us. So one thing is they're looking at the hospitals as a bank account. The other thing is that, and this is really, in my mind, one of the more horrific things, is they look at the mental health industry only looks at the quality of care received by those in the community. So what they do is they believe that closing hospitals reduces institutionalization. In my book, I have a chart that compares 1960 to today, and it shows total hospitalized in 1960, and it was like 550,000, something like that, and total hospitalized today. And it's way down. And it shows total mentally ill incarcerated in 1960, and total incarcerated, and it was very few, and total incarcerated today. So what you see is that closing hospitals did not reduce institutionalization. What it did is it moved institutionalization from hospitals into jail. The total number of people institutionalized in the 60s and today is roughly the same, with homelessness largely accounting for the difference. But the mental health industry doesn't look at those incarcerated. They're like no longer their problem. They've been transferred to the criminal justice system. I say when a mental health director, when somebody with serious mental illness gets arrested, that's a success for the mental health department. The person moved off their budget and onto the criminal justice budget. So the reason we have so few hospitals is because the mental health system has been complicit in moving these people to incarceration.
Yeah, you see, my understanding of it was always that the reason deinstitutionalization came about was because, a couple of things. One was that treatment got better, so it reduced the need for the hospitals, and the other was this idea of care in the community. So rather than having people institutionalized, it was better and more effective for people to be at home with the families and to be kind of establishing a normal routine. But that's not necessarily the case.
Yeah. No, the medicines did help. There was, and I won't get into details, but there was a financial incentive in the U.S. for people to close hospitals, because Medicaid would reimburse them for the people that were in those hospitals as long as they closed hospitals. But Dr. Fullatori wrote a book called American Psychosis, and it very clearly explained that the problem wasn't, as people say, that we didn't invest enough in community mental health centers. The problem then, like today, is that the money that went into the community mental health centers is not being used for the seriously ill. Virtually, they track the number of people who came out of hospitals and went into the community mental health centers, and it was very few. Basically, the community mental health centers then, like today, took on an expansive agenda of ending poverty, ending racism, improving grades, making people happier, helping people get jobs, improving mental wellness generally, and totally failed the seriously mentally ill. It was best documented in American Psychosis. It was also documented in a book by Dr. Jeffrey Lieberman. So, it's a myth created by the mental health industry is, you didn't give us enough money, and that's why we didn't serve the people who were coming out of the institutionalizations.
I've got to say, when it comes to things like this, I think a lot of people I suppose a lot of people would think that it sounds like a bit of a conspiracy, because I suppose the main question would be, what would anyone's motivation be for neglecting that part of the population that need the help the most?
It's a wonderful question. There's multiple reasons. One is there's a desire to normalize mental illness and to make like everyone is just like you and me, and it's kind of the exact opposite. So there's no desire of anyone with a mental health problem to associate with people with serious mental illness. Also, it is very difficult to treat the seriously ill. If somebody comes to your program and two people come to your program, one's been homeless, psychotic, eating out of a dumpster, and the other needs marriage counseling, 99.9% of the programs are going to admit the one who needs marriage counseling. It's a lot easier. It's a lot more rewarding. Also, if you're the executive director of a program, it's a lot easier and more rewarding to get a grant to do public education, talks at schools, run a public service announcement that has your logo on it, than it is to address somebody who's homeless, psychotic, and has serious mental illness. So you want to cherry pick the easiest to treat for entrance to your program, and you want to do that cost effectively. And as long as there are government grants to treat the seriously ill, people will use those grants, not treat the seriously ill. And then there's a civil rights issue. There's a large anti-psychiatry movement which believes that being psychotic, delusional, and hallucinating is a civil right to be protected rather than an illness to be treated. But as Herschel Hardin in Canada wrote, medications can free people from the Bastille of their psychosis and enable them to engage in a meaningful exercise of their civil liberties. So it's trends, the idea that you're looking at hospitals as a bank account that can fund your program, that you want the easiest to treat for your program, that you don't think you should have to treat anyone who doesn't volunteer for treatment. All these trends have led away from it. And also there's financial incentives. A diagnosis of PTSD can make any lawsuit seem more gain you a bigger settlement in any lawsuit. It can gain you government benefits. Obviously, the American Psychiatric Institute has a financial interest in seeing as many people diagnosed with something as possible. That's why there's been an expansion of childhood bipolar disorder. It's a real disorder, but recently the DSM made that easier to diagnose. It's the same with ADHD in children. So the industry has an incentive to create billing codes for normality. And all these combine to force them or to lead them to not focus on the most seriously mentally ill.
Right. This next question is probably, I'm guessing this is the most contentious issue of all. These massive prison numbers, I think maybe a lot of people kind of imagine that the people that are most seriously mentally ill, that the police are somehow just kind of going out there with a lasso and rounding people up and shoving them in cells for doing nothing, for maybe just acting a bit unusual. Firstly, I'm interested if that is the case at all. But what I'm leading up to here is this idea that this myth that's perpetuated in the mental health industry that the seriously mentally ill are no more likely to commit crime or violent acts than anybody else. And I know this is a super contentious issue, but this is one we need to get into, because it's obviously that if people are being incarcerated, surely they're being incarcerated for a reason. So if we could kind of delve into that a little bit.
Right. Well, first of all, most of the people incarcerated were not because of violent acts. They may be, they're stalking because in their delusions, they think they're married to a celebrity. They're trespassing is a common one because they have no place to sleep. They're dining and dashing because they can't get any food. So there's a lot of that. And then what happens is a lot of these petty crimes become serious crimes because the person will lash out or maybe hit the police officer. So now what was simply a vagrancy charge all of a sudden becomes attacking a law enforcement officer. So they escalate into crimes that then you get jailed for. The idea that the mentally ill, the 100%, the mentally ill, the 18% who have something in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual are not more violent than others. The seriously mentally ill are not more violent than others, but the untreated seriously mentally ill as a group are more violent than others. And the mental health industry has come up with all these different ways to cloud that reality. But the studies of mental illness and violence are almost always of the treated. They recruit people from community programs that are treating people, and then they say, okay, are they more violent than another population? The only thing those studies are showing is that medicines work. They're not showing the untreated seriously mentally ill are not more violent. Or the other way they'll do it is many of the violence studies exclude the violent. So there are people in the community, so they exclude those in jails, they exclude those in prisons, they exclude those in involuntary commitments, they exclude those in hospitals, they exclude those who were killed by police or killed themselves. So when you do exclude the violent, you find that the remainder are not more violent. But look at the reality. Psychiatrics are locked, liver units aren't. Psychiatric nurses wear panic buttons. Those in heart units don't. Police are called to deal with people with untreated serious mental illness, not untreated cirrhosis, and even the mental health workers who do outreach to the homeless mentally ill go out in pairs for their own safety. So it's fairly ludicrous for anyone to assert that untreated serious mental illness is not associated with violence. And because we won't admit to the problem with the mental health industry and the advocates won't admit to the problem, they can't play a role in fixing it.
Yeah, it's an important distinction to remember as well, though, is it's that it's untreated seriously mentally ill. Because, like, again, I've seen people arguing this point that they leave that part out of the argument, and that it's the untreated that are more likely to commit violent acts. Again, from your book, according to psychiatrist Involuntary, author of 9 books on serious mental illness and scores of studies, up to 10% of all US homicides are likely due to untreated serious mental illness. What I'm wondering is, when you've got the statistics there and the studies to back up this claim, why the continued denial of it? Is it cognitive dissonance? Is it political correctness? Is it virtue signaling?
No, it's the self-interest of the mental health industry. They do the people, the advocates, the National Alliance for the Mentally Ill, Mental Health America. The whole purpose is to normalize the illness. Want everyone to think that the mentally ill are high-functioning, successful members of society, and you won't see anyone who has psychosis or is eating out of a dumpster public service announcements, and this is a big problem. They are just focused on a different population, and there is no, at least in the States, there's no national organizations that are focused on the seriously ill. In fact, they shun them. Organizations give guidance to the media that say, don't use the word suffering when describing the mentally ill. That's ludicrous. Whenever there's profile instance of violence, rather than using that to teach the public what solutions might be, they go out there and criticize the media for reporting on it. And this is just all terribly counterproductive. What they'll do is sometimes they'll say, when there's an act of violence, they'll say the mentally ill are more likely demised as a way to divert attention from the violence. Well, in my book, I have data that shows that may or may not be true, but even if it's true, it's largely irrelevant, because the same treatments that reduce violence reduce victimization. But there is just this profound desire to disassociate, to shun the seriously mentally ill, and it comes from within the mental health industry, and you and I are kind of, in that circle, but outside the mental health industry, the public, the police, the patients themselves, the family members, the arguments I'm making are resonate, are true, they know it, but we can't release government policy from the stranglehold of the mental health industry, which wants to divert it elsewhere. Suicide. You want to talk suicide?
Well, yeah, definitely. We'll get to that. One remaining question I've got on this, though, is that, and you may have already answered it, and I might have missed it. But if we take that idea just one step further, I'm wondering, what is the motivation to normalize serious mental illness, to kind of, like you say, to say that, you know, everyone's the same, everyone can be high functioning and yada yada yada. What's the motivation to hide from that? Is the profit to be made there? Is it just too much to deal with? Is it people just too uncomfortable with it? Why that? Why?
Well, I'm not 100% sure that question should be directed to me versus those who are doing it. But as I said, if you're running a program, it's a lot easier to run the program if you don't have to accept people with serious mental illness into it. And if you're an advocate, you don't want to be associated, and you're a high-functioning, you know, they call them peers or consumers now, and you're high-functioning, you don't want anyone to think that you would be anything else. You know, another one is stigma. The mental health industry has raised stigma to deity. You continually hear that stigma is a major barrier to care, and so they're all out there getting easy contracts. We're going to reduce the stigma of mental illness. Well, several things. First of all, serious mental illness is a no-fault biologically based disease, so there's no stigma to having it, the same way there's no stigma to being, you know, gay, black, lefty, righty, or any of the other historically marginalized populations. So the mental health advocate should know better than anyone that there's no stigma to it. There is discrimination and prejudice against those that have it, but that involves fighting laws and policies, not going out and advertising we don't like stigma. But the fact is that stigma is not a major barrier to care. Families beg and plead for treatment and can't get it. The barriers to care have to do with the lack of available services, the lack of doctors, the lack of hospitals, the high cost, the lack of transportation, anosognosia, not being aware that you're ill, are far more major barriers to care than stigma is. But the mental health industry has convinced itself that this is the major barrier to care, and so associating with the seriously ill and mentioning that they exist is considered part of stigmatizing.
Yeah, DJ, if you'd like to, I wasn't sure what you were going to talk about with regards to suicide, but if you'd like to expand on that, and we can definitely go down that avenue.
Well, suicide is another area where the mental health industry is basically diverting funds. What happens is that, first of all, suicide is always horrible, but also exceedingly rare. I think there was 47,000 in the U.S. Last year. But what the industry does is say they can prevent suicide. Well, first of all, there's zero evidence that suicide campaigns reduce suicide. There's mild evidence they increase suicide. So the question is, should we be doing them? Even if you buy that we should be doing suicide campaigns, the suicide efforts are directed at youth. Youth are the least likely to commit suicide. Now, the mental health industry touts a statistic that half of all, suicide's the second leading cause of death in kids under 14 or 24, I forget right now, but it's the second leading cause of death. Well, that's because they die of very little. Of the 47,000-odd suicides, there were like 3,000 were in the under 24, and the 37,000 were in the over 24. Suicide is mainly an adult disorder, but we're spending the vast majority trying to do suicide efforts in schools versus where it is. It's mainly an adult disorder, people over 55. If you want to end suicide, you would target people over 55. You would target people with schizophrenia or bipolar disorder because they have a higher incidence. We have their names. The highest risk group is prisoners. So if you really want to reduce suicide numbers, you would go aim your efforts at prisons. And what they do to measure the success of these programs, they won't measure meaningful metrics when determining what programs are successful. So suicide campaigns, they will measure process, not progress. They won't measure how many suicides there are. They'll measure how many calls came into the helpline. Well, all you're measuring there is how successful your ad campaign was. Or they'll measure how many referrals were made. But whether the person received treatment or not isn't measured. So suicide is another giant area where the mental health industry is not only diverting funds, but they're preventing them from going to where they might possibly do the most good. Evidence-based programs. Everyone says, oh, we're in favor of evidence-based programs. But what the industry will do is they will come up with a number of meaningless metrics, largely meaningless, like sense of hopefulness, sense of empowerment, sense of wellness. And they'll say an uptick in any one of those, even if the others go down, shows the program's evidence base. But they won't measure the meaningful metrics. Does your program reduce homelessness, arrest, incarceration, suicide, and hospitalization? If the mental health industry would start measuring meaningful metrics, we could bring those rates down. So it's just, the industry's the problem.
Yeah, another one is where I suppose liberals or whoever feel like they're fighting for people's kind of civil liberties. Well, there's a couple. One is in advocating for banning the use of restraints and seclusions when people are hospitalised. But yeah, there's an interesting hidden consequence to that. If you'd like to just mention what that is.
Right. If once you take away the ability of a hospital to use restraints and seclusion, basically you're forcing them to call the police. So the advocates are turning patients into prisoners. And by the way, once they get to the jail, then they can use restraints and seclusion. But they won't allow it in the hospitals because the advocates are, quote, protecting the patients.
Yeah, and I think this brings us nicely onto the topic of kind of, I don't know what the exact term would be, kind of compulsory hospitalisation, where people immediately think the idea of somebody kind of being sectioned, as we'd call it over here, I don't know if it's the same over there, kind of somebody being admitted to a mental hospital against their will. The basic opinion people have of that, or the popular opinion, is that hospitalising somebody against the will is pretty much always a bad thing, and it takes away somebody's civil liberties. And again, that's something that you disagree with. So yeah, if you could go a little bit into that, please.
Yeah, well, first of all, I don't believe that the general population necessarily agrees with that. I know the mental health industry does, because there is a total obliviousness to those incarcerated. So here's the thing. I think very few people need involuntary hospitalization. I mean, very few need that. And what we should be looking at for civil liberties is to produce the amount of civil liberties. So the greatest infringement on civil liberties is when you throw somebody behind bars. So we should be looking to avoid that one. A step down from that would be hospitals. So hospitals basically can prevent incarceration. So that's better than that. But then you can go to one called outpatient commitment, which is much less than hospitalization. And what outpatient commitment does is it basically allows courts to order a very tiny group of the most seriously ill who already became arrested, incarcerated, needlessly hospitalized, or homeless as a result of their inability or failure to stay in treatment that could prevent those hospitalizations. It allows courts to order them to stay in treatment for 6 months or a year while they continue to live in the community. So here we have a tool that avoids a major infringement of civil liberties, which would be going into the hospital or going into incarceration, by putting a much less onerous, a less expensive, a less restrictive form of commitment on them. Civil liberties, the government in the U.S. has two valid reasons for imposing on civil liberties. Those are to protect the public from others, and that's what the police generally do, or to help those who can't help themselves. The mental health industry regularly says that any form of coercion is a violation of civil liberties. The reality is that courts make the decision, not the advocates. And the courts have decided that this is an appropriate use of the state's police powers and parents' patriarch powers. So the civil liberties is something used by the mental health industry is basically a battle cry for anything they don't like. It often has little connection to reality, for instance, their opposition to assisted outpatient treatment, which in effect prevents hospitalization and prevents incarcerations, but they still say that's violates civil liberties.
Yeah, another one on this topic would be this idea that, well, the law requires somebody to become a danger to themselves or others before they're ever going to be required to receive treatment. And I guess I'm wondering what's kind of going to be the best way around that, because I suppose, you know, on the one hand it makes sense, you want to kind of leave people alone, because it sounds a bit like Minority Report, I guess. Because that person's got schizophrenia, then they could possibly be a danger to society, so then we have to do something with them. But on the flip side, it works against people with serious mental illness, because we're waiting until they do something severe before anybody kind of steps in to help them. So what's the balancing act there?
Well, there's nobody I know who is saying that we should be able to involuntarily commit people because they have schizophrenia. That just, as far as I know, doesn't exist. Where you get into some debate is the question is, if you can commit somebody before they become if you can only commit somebody when they become danger to self or others, the question is, when does that danger occur? If you can only commit somebody after they become danger to self or others, does that danger occur when they start to become psychotic? Does it occur when they can't feed themselves anymore? Does it come when they buy a gun, when they buy bullets, when they aim the gun, when they shoot the gun? So it just is a question that the courts have been grappling with, is when does danger occur? And then there's other standards. You know, for instance, we don't require people with Alzheimer's or dementia to become danger to self or others before we treat them. We recognize that that would be fairly cruel, and should we expand some of those cognitive standards to somebody with mental illness? Now, what I think works fairly well is allowing courts and giving the person a free attorney, is to say, if they have a certain history of becoming violent, arrested, or incarcerated due to not staying in treatment, should we be able to compel that person to help develop a treatment plan and stay in it while in the community? And that works fairly well. 80% of those in it, as opposed to the mental health industry that purports to talk for them, but 80% of those who have been committed to community treatment, assisted outpatient treatment, said it helped them get well and stay well. And if they've been in the program for longer than a year, the benefits of that continue even after they're no longer under compelled treatment. So, you know, there are many reasonable solutions to this. The only one I don't know is, you know, how to stop a first-time person. So somebody develops schizophrenia and they start to become psychotic, but they have no history of violence, they have no history of needless homelessness, arrest, or incarceration. Stop that person, and it would be hard to come up with a fair standard that would do that. As Ellen Sachs said when you interviewed her, you know, involuntary inpatient commitment is not pretty. And so how do we avoid that? And outpatient commitment is one way to avoid that.
Yeah, I suppose coming to the end of this now, before we kind of talk about some, like, well, I'm interested in some broad recommendations that you have, which I know you work at the policy level, but one thing I'm interested in is things that can be done by the people listening to this podcast, people like me, that kind of work within this industry, but that maybe not considered these things before. And on that note, one interesting thing I've heard you talk about was the incident where Dr. Phil interviewed Shelley Duvall, who was, for people who don't know, Shelley Duvall was the actress in The Shining. I'm sure she's done loads more, but that's the only one I recognise her from. And Dr. Phil hosted an interview with her where she was clearly not well, speaking incoherently, and say all kinds of random things about the Bermuda Triangle and Robin Williams still being alive and that she's seen him, etc. And what I find interesting about that, DJ, is that with things like smoking campaigns, and cancer, all those kinds of things. Like, it seems it's okay for an anti-smoking campaign to use somebody who's, say, got emphysema on an advert on TV. So you've got somebody there who's clearly suffering, they can't breathe, they're receiving oxygen, or somebody who's got cancer. I mean, over here in the UK, we've got pictures on cigarette packets of body parts that have got cancer and are kind of rotting away. And what's interesting is it's okay to use those images to advocate for those conditions. But when it comes to people with serious mental illness, we don't want to know. We don't want to see that. Like when Shelley Duvall went on Dr. Phil, people were outraged by it. They don't want to see somebody in that state. And I'm wondering of a way around that, because obviously for me, it seems like it shocked me when I watched that interview, and it's only by seeing somebody in that state who's not high functioning, who's obviously not well, that makes you feel like, God, maybe the little bit of tithing that you do, the 10% of your income that you donate to charity, it's only images like that are going to make that an attractive prospect to people. But I'm just wondering why you think it is that people are so uncomfortable with that being out there in the open.
Well, first of all, I think your analogies are excellent. And again, when you say people, you mean in the mental health industry. My biggest thing, which I've noticed, for many years I've tried to solve and haven't been able to, is how do I let the public see what serious mental illness looks like? The mental health industry is adamant that the public not see that. And when the Shelley Duvall incident happened, the industry went apocalyptic, and they got him to pull it. And I don't think the segment is available online anymore, and he probably issued an apology. So it's a huge. I've tried to go to the police because they have camera footage sometimes of their encounters with the untreated serious mental illness. So letting people see what untreated serious mental illness looks like is, for the reasons you said, exceedingly important, and the mental health industry is dead set against that happening almost unanimously. I know no one in the mental health industry who's tried to enable the public to see what untreated serious mental illness looks like.
Yeah, I think one of the big things is like the issue of consent. It seems that, when somebody's not well in that sense, that they can't consent to take part, to kind of participate in advertising campaigns and the like. But what I did think was interesting is that when I was reading the YouTube comments under the video of Shelley doing that interview, that seemed to be the main reason. People were saying, well, she's obviously not well enough to consent to take part in this interview. But I can't help but feel that the same people that would complain that she's not well enough to consent to an interview are the same people that would support her right to turn down treatment as well, which seems a bit contradictory.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. That's it. That's exactly it.
So let's talk, quickly. I mean, if anyone wants to go into this in any depth, I definitely recommend your book. People use the word tour de force for books a lot, but and I rarely agree with it. But this one's really a smack in the face, especially for somebody like me that feels like. I thought I knew a thing or two about a thing or two when it came to the mental health industry, but there was a lot of surprises in there. But just broadly, what would your broad recommendations be to kind of fixing some of these issues?
You can interfere. You can change the system at different levels. So it's like, what are you compassionate about? Some people are compassionate about the research, so that that we don't have these illnesses, others about treatment, some about, improving how the police interact, some improving care for the incarcerated. So what I would advise is, whatever turns you on, do that, but go deep. Don't be superficial about it. And I find too many people don't know the policies and laws that are making what they're concerned about true. For myself, I don't work with the mental health industry much anymore. The public, police, criminal justice, district attorneys are much more interested, conservatives are much more interested in solving this problem than the mental health industry. So I have not found it's productive to work with them. All the progress we've had legislatively in the U.S. is coming as a result of conservatives, police, criminal justice. So that would be a strong recommendation, is we tend to want to train the police how to handle the mentally ill better. And I think if you ask any police why they can't help the mentally ill, they're going to say because there's not enough hospitals and it's too hard to get somebody involuntarily committed to inpatient or outpatient treatment. So we have to start listening to those who want to solve the problem and boldly, that's what it is. Boldly, it is start focus. Ask, does the program you're supporting improve a meaningful metric like reducing homelessness, arrest, incarceration, suicide, or hospitalization? If it's not improving a meaningful metric in persons with serious mental illness, then that program shouldn't be funded, and the fund should go to a program that does improve those. We have to spend less on mental health, more on mental illness, and replace mission creep with mission control, to form organizations that want to improve services for the most seriously ill. And I don't know how it is over there, but right now in the U.S., there are only mental health organizations. There are not mental illness organizations. So those have to form up.
Yeah, I've got to say, it's from... I don't know if this is just kind of like a willful blindness on my part, because I tend to focus on like anxiety related issues because that's been my experience. But yeah, the concept of serious mental illness, not so much. I mean, I don't know of. I mean, I follow quite a lot of people on Twitter, and it's just, I don't know about an organisational level, but I know at the level of, well, just at the level of conversation and advocacy, there doesn't seem to be very much there. And I suppose that, relates to this question really is, reading your book kind of made me feel a little bit uncomfortable about what I do. Because even though I haven't got any friends or relatives with a serious mental illness, I haven't got any first-hand experience with it, I don't want to be complicit in diverting attention away from that. And I'm just wondering what can somebody like me, I mean, there's loads of us now, bloggers, depression, anxiety, you know, everyone's got a blog. I'm just wondering what we can do that's helpful while still doing what we know to do in the first place.
Okay, so when there's a major act of violence that's due to somebody with schizophrenia, not anxiety, the mental health industry is going to be out there saying that, you know, the mentally ill are no more violent than others, and we need more peer support or some other program that's not proven to do anything. So I've found the only time there's a public interest in solving the problem is when there are these high-profile acts of violence, and it's going out in writing, okay, even though it's not about what I personally know about anxiety, what I do know is that, you know, for the seriously mentally ill who go untreated, they are more violent than others. Some of the things we know reduce those acts of violence are access to hospitals, access to doctors, case management, good community services that are willing to serve the seriously mentally ill and to start to propose solutions. This is especially true, even more so than the blogs, because unfortunately the blogs, and I'm guilty of this as anyone, but our blogs reach the mental health industry, and what we're going to win this battle by taking it out of the hands of the mental health industry and putting it into the hands of the public, which, as I say, is fourscore behind the things that I'm talking about. I've never met anyone, hardly, other than those in the mental health industry who don't want to focus on the seriously mentally ill, don't think they should get hospitals when needed, don't think they should be compelled to take treatment when it could prevent violence, think that we should prioritize improving grades with mental health funds rather than delivering treatment to the seriously mentally ill with mental health funds. So we need people to speak out. What are the solutions at a time when the public is interested in those?
Okay, and just out of interest, I'm wondering how is the Trump administration doing so far as all this goes? Has any progress been made?
It's tough. The administration did reach out to me during the campaign, and they asked for policies, and I gave them a stack of pages. They adopted two of them. One was to make it harder for the seriously mentally ill to get guns, and the other was to provide parents relief from HIPAA, patient confidentiality. Within 90 days, the Trump administration signed a bill to make it easier for the seriously mentally ill to get guns, and they've done nothing on HIPAA. He has a point. There was a bill passed mainly by Republicans, Tim Murphy, John Cornyn, in the Senate, that starts to focus the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration on the seriously ill, and it created a new position called an Assistant Secretary of Mental Health. Trump made a brilliant appointment to that. Hasn't been confirmed by the Senate yet, but he nominated Eleanor McCants-Katz, who had been highly critical of federal mental health policy for failing to focus on the seriously ill. It's interesting on the gun issue, and it's a little bit related to your comment about Shelley Duvall. They didn't think she had consent to do the show, but she does have consent, enough competency to treatment. Is the mental health industry largely opposed gun restrictions for the seriously mentally ill, that would violate their rights, and the fact that thousands commit suicide with guns and others commit violence. One of the things that I've been surprised the mental health industry hasn't recognized is that while violence is rare, it is violence by the minority that tars the majority, and no stigma campaign is going to trump the bullet of a mass killer. So if you believe stigma exists, the best way to reduce it is to provide treatment for the seriously ill who are likely to become violent, and that will start to reduce any stigma.
Wow. Yeah, that's a powerful note to end on, DJ. If before I let you go, though, just like everybody else, after we've been talking about all these serious issues, I do like to raise the mood a little bit by subjecting you to my quickfire questions, if that's okay.
Sure. Can I say one thing before that, though?
Oh, go ahead.
In answer to your question about what can people like you do, I think it's, and by the way, 100% of any proceeds I get from the book go to either Treatment Advocacy Center or Mental Illness Policy Org, and I take no salaries, and I'm not making any money off this book or any of my work. But one of the things people can do is buy the book for their legislator, and that would be very helpful, is sending this book out to your legislator, because there's all chapter on here are different bills you can propose to fix the system. So I would suggest that's something else you can do.
Yeah, well, I'll include a link in the show notes for people to purchase the book on Amazon. And, well, you've actually preempted my first question as well. So do you have any book recommendations on this topic or anything else you feel would be of value to the listeners?
Well, Surviving Schizophrenia is still the Bible by Fuller Torrey, Saving Normal by Dr. Alan Francis. I just finished a great book, Brain on Fire, by Susan Callan, and what she talks about, because misdiagnosis of mental illness is big. There are other illnesses that mimic mental illnesses, and making sure that you get a thorough evaluation is really important. Javier Amador wrote, I'm Not Sick, I Don't Need Help, and this is a book specifically on how parents mainly can help convince someone who doesn't believe they are ill to accept treatment. And it works really well in a lot of cases, not all, but if you have a family member who doesn't know they're sick and can't, and so therefore won't accept treatment, that's a good book to read to learn techniques on how you might do that.
Okay. Interested in this one. I'm only going to give you one, allow you one though. So if you could take the reins of power at the Department of Health, what policy would you implement to improve the mental well-being of the general public or the severely mentally ill? But I'm only going to give you one policy. So which is the top one?
I would probably say expand the use of assisted outpatient treatment. It's a more compassionate, less restrictive form of commitment. It saves 50% of the cost of care, thereby freeing up money for to treat more people who have serious mental illness. So I would say that as a specific one. And I'm not allowed to say my second.
Oh, you can't do that to me, DJ. What's the second one? What's the second one?
Well, that worked well. Hospitals, and I guess I can't say my third one.
Well, go on. Let's give you. I'm going to give you three.
Okay. It would be, but I would take them in that order, and it would be generally, it's a little more amorphous, but focus the existing mental health budget on improving meaningful metrics in people with serious mental illness, programs that reduce homelessness, arrest, hospitalization, incarceration.
Okay. Right, the more philosophical ones now. What, if anything, keeps you up at night?
It keeps me awake.
What? It could be literally what keeps you awake. A lot of people say the kids, or it could be just something that worries you, that plays on your mind a lot.
Well, I'm a member of a lot of groups, and I get a lot of emails and messages from moms who have kids who are becoming tragedies, homeless, arrested, incarcerated, and that I can't solve their problem. This bothers me a lot. I'm just another person who's referring them to someplace else that's not going to help them either. And the moms who are walking on eggshells in their homes, whose fear that what they say is going to cause an outburst, that they have to sleep with their doors locked, that they have to call police on their own loved ones. I don't know, and it's, there are other relatives who do this too, but I don't know how the moms go through this. And when I get these letters, it bothers me.
What's the best piece of life advice anyone's ever given you?
It's easier to get forgiveness than permission.
Ooh, I like that one. Oh, that could be used in all kinds of contexts. What mistakes do you continue to make despite knowing better?
I am getting better now, but as I said, I've largely given up on trying to convince the mental health industry. The mental health industry I don't see as part of the solution, but occasionally I fall back into it. And so I'll spend time trying to convince somebody in the industry that they are wrong, or a leader of an organization. And time is much more productive spent. For instance, I'm speaking next month in Florida at a major police conference. That time is going to be much more productive than any time trying to convince people in the mental health industry that change needs to be made.
Okay, final three. What part of your career are you most proud of?
Currently, professionally, I was in advertising. I said I had the world's most meaningless job. If I get up, people wouldn't know Wheaties was 5 cents off that day. And over the last 30 years, either volunteering or I've been doing this full time maybe for the last 15 or so. Every day I wake up and I'm trying to make care better for somebody. And I was sick a while ago, and I didn't, there was a question as to, how serious it was. And I felt very comfortable because I know I've spent my, last 10, 15 years or whatever exceedingly useful. The book has been both my website, Mental Illness Policy Org, and the book. I'm hoping now that this empowers somebody, inspires somebody, younger, more energetic now to take this work and go on, as a book called Madness in the Streets did for me. That's out of print now, but Rael Jean Isaac's Madness in the Street was really a seminal book in all the stuff that I'm talking about now.
Wow. Okay, outside of family and career, what investment of time or money has brought you the most joy or fulfillment?
Well, this isn't career or, this is my avoc. I don't get paid for this. It's what I do. So I'm not sure outside my mental health advocacy is. Then I live in Harlem, a relatively impoverished community, and we throw an annual Halloween party for the kids up here, and I'm involved in the community, and I find that, really satisfying.
That's a brilliant answer. Okay, the big one. What do you think is the key to happiness?
I guess I say I don't have an introspective bone in my body, so I don't want to say for what other people, but I'm doing what I love, and I imagine if other people did that would be the key. Happiness. I have total, maybe unfounded confidence in what I'm doing. Other people's opinions don't matter that much to me, and I think that's kind of a benefit to happiness.
Okay. DJ Jaffe, thank you very much. Is there any links that you'd like to direct the listeners to? And if you're on social media, feel free to plug away.
Oh, okay. Well, yes. First of all, our homepage, mentalillnesspolicy.org, and then on Facebook and Twitter. On Facebook, I have a group called the National Alliance on Serious Mental Illness. So that's a group, or if you prefer a page, it would be Mental Illness Policy Org. So we have both a page, Mental Illness Policy Org, and a group, National Alliance on Serious Mental Illness. I'm on Twitter. I think it's Mental Illness Policy. And then the most important one would be, for now, would be to go to get the book, Insane Consequences, How the Mental Health Industry Helps the Mentally Ill. It's at your local bookstore, or you can ask them to order it, hopefully. And if not, it is on Amazon and Barnes & Noble, hardcover, Nook, and Kindle, and it's relatively cheap.
Yeah, and it's, like I say, it's a very compelling read and a very convincing read as well.
And what I did, too, is it's heavily sourced. So I have footnotes for everything. And what it allows advocates to do is to, you can find the fact, find the source of the fact, and then you can use the book to construct your own arguments for improving the system of care, because you can go right to the source material. So I think it's useful for advocates.
Okay, perfect. DJ, thank you very much.
Thank you for all you do.
Okay, folks, if you enjoyed this episode, actually, for those of you who didn't enjoy this episode, you guys can bugger off and skip this bit because it doesn't apply to you. But if you did enjoy this episode and you'd like to help support this podcast, there are a number of ways you can do so. You could blast out a little mention on social media saying, yeah, check this knobhead out, he's actually pretty good. You could like our Facebook page or leave us a review there, even better. Just search for My Own Worst Enemy on Facebook. I'm sure we'll pop up. You could leave us a positive review on iTunes or Stitcher or whichever podcast service you happen to use. It's always a nice way of encouraging new listeners to give us a whirl. Or, if you're feeling particularly generous and you feel that this podcast is genuinely adding some value and you'd like to support it in a more long-term sense, then you can become a subscriber for as little as £1 a month. Or you could just make a one-off donation, again, for as little as £1. So, yeah, if you'd like to sponsor the podcast, just go to myownworstenemy.org/support, but only if you can afford it, and, no donations from stolen credit cards either, please. Can't be arsed with that hassle. So, yeah, plenty of things to keep you busy there while I go busy myself putting the next episode together. So, in the meantime, as I always say, behave yourselves, but not too much, and I'll see you again next time.